Chapter 8. A Tournament as Practice. To say that Jen's life was changing rapidly would be an understatement. Being faced with wholly unexpected events again and again, having to be reactive rather than proactive, was beginning to get to her. Jen was a strategist. She was used to always thinking and planning 3 steps ahead of anyone who stood against her. But right now, she was in that awkward period where she simply didn't have enough to do that. In fact, she might never leave that awkward period again. She couldn't shake the compulsion to be proactive in whatever way she still could. With all that running through her mind, fighting for her concentration, Jen stood in the training room in the basement of her house, her eyes closed, surrounded by wood-paneled walls and racks of training weapons, focusing, trying to break down the last barriers to unlocking the full potential of her soul. Jen knew that she was no slouch in battle. She had similar talents to many members of her family, but her soul's manifested abilities had never been particularly powerful in the blunt kind of way that made fighting so easy for the others. Instead, she could alter the energy of her soul to make herself lighter or heavier, and she had learned to weave symbols into the world that could mark places or people with her energies. These powers suited her, of course, as someone who preferred to control the battlefield, and she had enjoyed finding ways to make those abilities powerful through strategy. But there was no denying that sometimes sheer power and speed were at least as beneficial. Simply put, Jen was the slowest on Team Dueling Hearts, and while she wasn't the weakest physically speaking, her best option for mobility made her strikes less effective. Sarah, until recently, hadn't been much faster, but now even she had access to Aunt Shannon's signature Life from the Earth technique, increasing her potential speed to rival that of someone with an aura. If Jen was going to continue to compete, she needed to increase her speed without limiting her power. Creating an aura was the fastest way that Jen knew to do that, and yet she was still unable to break down that particular wall. Looking at things objectively, as she always strove to do, and considering how well she understood the technicalities of the process, she couldn't help but feel annoyed by her lack of progress in that area. Jen stopped focusing her energies and took a deep breath, her eyes fluttering open. She let out a huge sigh and threw a few machine gun punches out of frustration. Her lack of progress creating an aura wasn't the only thing bothering her. I should have known, she thought. Just like the other dueling hearts, Jen hadn't realized that the Soul Takers would return at some point regardless of Karen, Monty, and Lawrence's actions. She had been afraid of the possibility, so she hadn't allowed herself to consider it until the Reaper's arrival had forced her to. Now she had to get stronger so she could defend herself and her family and make up for her mistake. Before she could decide how to continue her training, however, she heard the muffled sound of the doorbell upstairs. It caught her off guard. She hadn't realized that it was already so late in the morning. She let the remainder of her generated soul dissipate, then made her way up into the main house to greet her guests, even if a very large part of her didn't want to. Jen reached the living room in seconds. As she walked to the door located past the far end of the room, she passed by her little sister, Chris, sitting on the couch and playing a handheld video game. Chris looked a lot like a miniature Jen, just without the gothy overtones. She was shorter and thinner than her sister and shared her eye color. Her hair matched the undyed parts of Jen's hair and color, but it was wavy, somewhere between the straightness of Jen's and the curliness of Sarah's. Jen ignored her sister and swung the door open. Waiting there behind it was Sarah and Tucker, with Monty and Lawrence in tow. They looked very much like a group that didn't want to be together, with Tucker and Lawrence being a source of the majority of the bad vibes being given off. Jen wasn't surprised by that at all. The two of them had developed a fast rivalry, ending with Lawrence gravely injuring Tucker. Jen had seen the severity of the wound. She didn't blame Tucker for holding a grudge. She'd only been able to put up with the presence of Lawrence so far by, of course, remaining objective, which was something that Tucker didn't really excel at. "You ready for this?" Tucker asked, trying to sound as casual as he could. "Yeah," Jen answered, motioning the 4 of them inside. "Just let me grab a quick change of clothes. Just because we're not taking this tournament too seriously doesn't mean I don't plan to represent." She left her guests in the living room and made her way down the hallway to her bedroom, grabbing one of her sheer black shirts, some black and purple leggings, and a black skirt, all of which she slipped on over her exercise clothes. She rejoined the others in less than a minute. With her mind already on clothing, she couldn't help but note what they were wearing. Monty and Lawrence were dressed as they had been the day before, having nothing to change into. Meanwhile, Tucker wore a black t-shirt with the symbol of the local fire department on the breast and a pair of gray sweats. Sarah was dressed, as usual, in one of her yellow jerseys along with a pair of blue shorts. "I gotta admit," Jen told her companions, "I'm looking forward to this. Such a low-level tournament would be good for practice. Is this really the right time to be practicing your abilities when we have another purpose? Monty asked her. A thing can be two things, she replied. Worst case scenario, I mess up and get knocked out, but that isn't likely to happen in an event like this one anyway. And even if I do, that doesn't affect the ability of the rest of you to compete. It's just the kind of zero consequences environment that I prefer when trying out new techniques. That makes a surprising amount of sense, Monty admitted. Hang around with us long enough, Sarah told him, and you'll realize that most of what she says does. This is all well and good, Lawrence said adversely, crossing his arms, but if we don't get there in time to enter, we'll miss our chance to participate at all, no matter our reasons. Which, as Monty reminded you, will mean missing out on more than just your chance to practice. I know, Jen reassured him. You're right. We need to get going. The five of them made their way toward the door again, and as they did, Chris surprised them all by standing up suddenly and stepping up to her sister's side as if she intended to go with them. What are you doing? Jen asked her. You said something about a tournament, Chris answered. Jen looked to the others. None of them had expected Chris to want to go with them. Can you even fight? Lawrence asked her harshly, but Chris ignored his tone, nodding absent-mindedly without so much as looking at him. Does she know the real reason we're competing? Monty asked Jen, leaning in close and speaking quietly. Jen looked at her sister, who was examining her hands as if she'd never seen them before, and she smiled. Chris is pretty checked out most of the time, she replied. So, no, she doesn't. But she's also unlikely to get in the way either, and she's actually pretty tough. Monty looked at Lawrence questioningly, and Lawrence shrugged and rolled his eyes. Without any further discussion, the group, now 6 large, walked a few blocks to the nearest bus stop and waited for the next bus toward the city to arrive. They said very little to each other the entire time, and they sat in 2 distinct groups during the trip. It was a stark reminder that the Dueling Hearts and the former Soul Takers were not friends, and just barely allies. The ride wasn't a short one, taking more than 30 minutes, and the walk from the bus stop to the dojo hosting the tournament took another 10. Jen had never been to the location before, and she was surprised to see just how shabby it was. It was larger than Wilson's, with a big parking lot out front, but that parking lot was cracked and fading, with a raised section that was inaccessible to cars. It was located right up against a wide ditch separating it from a noisy highway ramp. The building itself was covered in faded, peeling paint, loose siding and shingles, and its windows were obscured by layers of dirt. Even though the place was known to have several relatively powerful students, and even though it was hosting a tournament featuring some of them, there didn't seem to be very many people there when Jen's group arrived. The 6 of them entered the building to find less than a dozen other fighters standing around awkwardly on and around 4 standard training mats. The occupants of the building all turned to look at the new arrivals. Jen sized them up, reaching out with her senses, trying to assess their abilities. Many of them came off as completely unremarkable. Maybe one day they would grow strong enough to be a threat to Jen and her companions, but right now, they simply weren't. 4 of them, however, were much more interesting. One of them, a girl younger than Jen, looked to be of Asian descent, but with an undertone of pinks and greens rather than purples. She sized Jen's group up with a wry smile. The second was a tall, broad-shouldered guy about Joe's age with a square jaw and sandy blonde hair, who flashed Jen a gleaming white smile. The third, another male, was smaller in frame, but Jen couldn't tell whether he was younger. His hair was darker and his attitude reminded Jen of Lawrence's. The fourth, though, was the most interesting of them all. He had medium-length brown hair, with a noticeable waviness to it, and dark eyes that complemented his dark skin. He wore an olive-green, skin-tight, long-sleeved t-shirt that showed off his well-defined muscles, and yet Jen could tell just from the way he carried himself that he wasn't some bruiser. There was an air of delicacy to him, like that of a dancer. When Jen reached out toward him with her sixth sense, she felt what she could only describe as a broad emptiness with the potential to fill itself at any moment. He didn't feel powerful per se, but he felt as if he could make himself more powerful than anyone in that room, save perhaps the Dueling Hearts and their allies, with little more than a thought. His energy, what Jen actually perceived of it anyway, also felt familiar to her, in a way that she wouldn't understand until after he'd faced the Dueling Hearts' test. Unsurprisingly to Jen, she got the sense that this fighter was reaching out with his senses and assessing Jen and her companions in the same way that she was. She saw his expression shift to one of interest as he met Jen's eyes while looking over her and the others. They had managed to intrigue him, and that intrigued Jen in return. Him, Jen said to the others, still looking at the fourth of the interesting fighters. If anyone here is going to be a bearer of one of the fragments, it's going to be him. Yeah, Monty agreed at her side. I see what you mean. But there are other candidates here, too. He indicated the other 3 fighters that Jen had already picked out. All right, Sarah told the 2 of them, stepping past them and further into the dojo. Let's get entered into this thing. Lawrence followed close behind her, with Chris following absent-mindedly at his side. Jen, Monty, and Tucker followed a couple steps later. Yo, Sarah asked bombastically, we want to enter this tournament. How might we go about doing that? One of the least remarkable occupants of the dojo, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, stepped forward to meet them. "Hello," he said. "Hello. Welcome to my dojo. I'm not much of a fighter myself, as you can see, but I've done my best to create a place where people who are more gifted than me can come together and get as strong as they want. Name's Jackson, by the way. Jack, if you prefer. You kids all want to enter the tournament?" "That's right," Lawrence told him. "Excellent," Jack exclaimed, with a genuine smile. "With you 6, that gives us 16. That's good for a single elimination bracket. Let me get you guys' names, and I'll go ahead and draw one up." He led the group over to a table off in the corner and signed them up. The bulk of their group loitered in the area of the table for a few more minutes while Jack randomized the names of the 16 participants on his outdated computer, and then printed out a sheet of paper with a bracket on it. He walked over to the back wall of the main room and taped the bracket up for everyone to see. Meanwhile, Monty mingled with the other participants, learning their names and returning a few minutes later with that information. "There are 4 mats in here," he told Jen, standing at her side, "so it seems likely that the fights will happen 4 at a time." "How are we going to scan all 4 of the fighters that we want to scan?" Sarah asked from her place at Monty's other side. "I'm fighting one of them at the start," Jen answered, glancing at the chiseled blonde guy, who she knew now was named Nate. "So it makes sense for me to take the ring first. After that, we need to make a choice. Assuming that you and I both win our first matches, we'll be fighting people of interest at the same time in round 2. "Right," Sarah said, glancing toward the girl with Asian features and the smaller framed guy with the Lawrence-like attitude. "Mina and Ray." "Lawrence and I don't fight until the second group," Monty assured them. "We'll watch them both and try to determine which of them is most likely to be a bearer of the soul, and we'll decide who will wear the ring in the second round that way. Otherwise, there's just Rocky." Monty gestured toward the most intimidating of the 4, who had impressed Jen so much during their initial assessment. "Tucker fights him in the second group of the first round. In the meantime," he took the little silver ring, hanging from a silver chain, out of his pocket and handed it to Jen. "You'll be needing this." Jen hesitated for just a moment before slipping it over her head. "Out of curiosity," Sarah asked, "how do we know that this won't just sense our special souls and give us, false positives or whatever?" "There's no risk of that," Monty answered. "The technique woven into the rings only acknowledges the wearer's soul enough to power it, and to compare it to the strongest soul signal mingling with it in the area. It literally can't test the wearer's energies." "Then it sounds like everything's set," Jen announced, and she walked over to the mat closest to the door where her opponent was already standing, waiting. Whether she was prepared for the future or not, it was time to move forward.